All right, class. Hello. Welcome to the home stretch for real. Um, just wanted to start off with a couple announcements. If you did the extra credit assignment, I will get that in the computer as soon as possible to replace two of your lowest grades. And the second essay will be graded by the weekend, is my present goal. That way it'll give you a couple of days to take a look at the feedback and perhaps apply some of the tips and pointers to your essay 3, which you will recall is an essay about the value of literature and what literature can tell us about the world in which we live. So we're going to be playing a little bit of catch up today, talking about a piece of literature that I like called Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. And this is the one that I assign around the time that you are learning how to write an argumentative essay and a persuasive essay, because this is perhaps the most persuasive piece of writing that I will assign and have assigned. It's very well calculated. There is strategy, emotion, and depth to it, and so we're just going to read over it, as much of it as we can get to, the important points, and discuss them, meaning I'm going to talk at you and you're going to listen from your couch at home. That's as close as we can get to a discussion. If you do have any questions about it, you can feel free to email me. So I'll just read parts of it. First of all, I want to point out that this was written from a jail cell in response to criticism from the white clergymen of Birmingham. So this would include Christian pastors and preachers and priests and the like. And also it included rabbis. So you will notice that given that specific audience, Dr. King is very careful to sort of placate their sensibilities with what he says. It was in response to the assertion that his actions in Birmingham, actions which led to his arrest for having a parade without a permit, were unwise and untimely. And this is his response. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all of the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill, and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and unreasonable terms. So right there you can notice a few things. The first is that he makes a point to appeal to their better nature by calling them men of genuine goodwill. Now, you'll recall these people were sort of on the other side of the fence in terms of what they were trying to enact in the city of Birmingham. They were resistant to change. And yet he still makes a point to appeal to their better nature because that's how he's going to get things done. He also strikes a tone by saying that he is going to be patient and reasonable, sort of portraying himself in good faith as well. I think I should indicate why I am here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president in the Southern Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I am here because I have organizational ties here. So now he is systematically dismantling their sort of criticisms of him. One of them being is that he was unwise and untimely, and the other one being that he is an outsider. And he says, I'm not an outsider because I have organizational ties. But he continues. But more basically, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. So here's an appeal to authority, and it's an appeal to biblical authority. And the reason this works is because Dr. King is considering his audience. His audience is pastors, preachers, rabbis, and they all have this shared sort of history, the Judeo-Christian history that he is appealing to. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. Excuse me. So this is a good strategy as well, trying to argue that you can't really call me an outsider because fate is mutually intertwined, the fate of people, the fate of places, and so to say I'm an outsider is just ridiculous because there is no outsider. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with the effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. We have gone through all of these steps in Birmingham. There can be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is well known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. These are the hard, brutal facts of the case. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers, but the latter consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation. So there's a couple of things here that are interesting. The first is this idea of nonviolent direct action. And the sort of steps that you must go through before you instigate such a campaign. The first, he says, is to determine whether injustices exist. So there is some sort of information gathering that takes place, and it's done in person. Then there is negotiation, which is an attempt to contact the power structures and try to reach some sort of middle ground. And then there's this interesting one, which is self-purification. And he goes on to explain later what that is, but it is literally the purifying of the self so that you can tolerate violence being done on your own person. And this is something that I think kind of baffles people now. How is it that you could endure violence and still hope to win a conflict? Shouldn't you fight back? And wouldn't that be a wiser thing to do? And of course, Dr. King borrowed some of his ideas from Mahatma Gandhi, who was able to assist with the liberation of India from the British Empire, and he did so through nonviolent means. And so it's interesting how these ideas play out, because you would think nonviolence wouldn't work so well. Then, last September, came the opportunity to talk with the leaders of Birmingham's economic community. In the course of the negotiations, certain promises were made by the merchants, for example, to remove the store's humiliating racial signs. So here he's talking about, I'm not going to, this part is sort of specified to people living in Birmingham. But here he's talking about, he requested that the segregation signs be removed. And they said that they would remove them, and then come to find out they did not. So then he says, well, we waited through Easter season and we waited through the election, and now we've decided that we can't delay it any longer. So he's responding again to the idea that his actions were untimely. And he's responding to this by logically refuting that premise, saying, no, we delayed it several times, and we can't delay it any longer. So the question, why, you may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't a negotiation a better path? You are quite right for calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent register may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we seek the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. This is an interesting idea, this idea of tension. Because today it seems, and I'm just generalizing here, but I do feel like there is a tendency of some people to avoid tension at all costs. You know, we don't want to have to deal with the unpleasantries of our disagreements. And yet, if we allow those disagreements and those unpleasantries to go unnoticed, then they just kind of fester and become worse. And so Dr. King's argument is that the only way to get real change to happen is by creating this tension. And you guys know, tension is uncomfortable, but just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean it's bad. And I think that's really smart. And also, mentioning Socrates is another appeal to authority. He uses each side of the persuasive triangle, ethos, pathos, and logos in this piece. And the appeal to Socrates is smart because Socrates had an influence on Western civilization and democracy, and he, being the father of Greek philosophy, and so it was a smart appeal to mention Socrates. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. I therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in a tragic effort to live in monologue rather than dialogue. So he's saying the entire purpose of this direct action program, which involves sit-ins and boycotts and marches, is to create the tension that is necessary to achieve dialogue, which is talking to each other. One of the most basic points in your statement is that the action that I and my associates have taken in Birmingham is untimely. So here's some more stuff. I'm sorry, this is more stuff about the mayor. And so this is where, right here in this paragraph, which is kind of long, but this is where you'll notice that his tone changes. He says up here, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. Now you're going to notice a tonal shift, okay? If you'll recall in the start of the piece, Dr. King started off very sort of calm, collected, attempted to make a sort of good faith gesture to the people he was talking to, attempted to consider their own egos in the situation, but now he's going to turn up the heat, right? This is where he lays on the pathos, which is the emotion, and you can hear a bit of his his sort of righteous anger and his hunger for justice in that way. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait, but when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconsciousness bitterness towards white people. So here he's laying on the pathos of the children and bringing up the children as a means of getting them to understand the emotional intensity that is fueling the actions that are taking place. So it's a smart strategy on his part. This we have to cover this. This is the bit about the unjust law. He says that, there is the problem that he faces, which is that he is breaking the law by carrying a parade, which is technically what the marches were, without a permit. There is a law against that. He is breaking the law. So a person who is completely pro-order might say, well, you're breaking laws. You can't break laws. Laws are there for a reason. So now he's going to give you this this bit about the just law and the unjust law. And this is the one part of the piece that I kind of, I'm not going to say that I take issue with it, but I don't necessarily know that it holds up under scrutiny, this idea of a just law and an unjust law, because how do we determine which law is just and which law is unjust? And he does give an answer for that, but I'm not terribly satisfied with the answer. So what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. So this is an interesting idea. But it supposes a couple of things. Number one, it supposes that the moral law of God is universal. If the moral law of God was universal, then it would apply to every country regardless of its religion, right? Because that would be obvious. It would be obvious that the morality was there. I don't know that that's necessarily true. If you look at the various parts of the world, there are different moral codes everywhere you go. There are some civilizations in history, for example, that did things that we would consider completely unthinkable, but it was just a normal part of their society. If you're speaking specifically about the Christian God, I think that is a problem in that it excludes a huge population of the Earth's people, right? Because only a certain percentage are Christian. There are numerous other religions with, millions and billions of followers. So I think that's kind of a problem. I think saying that it squares with the law of God. Well, which God? And I think most of my students in West Georgia will say, well, God. And it's like, yeah, okay, fine, but you have to consider that not everywhere has the same God, not everywhere has the same moral code. So suggesting that such is universal and apparent I don't know that that's true. I just don't know. I'm not going to say that it isn't true, but I think it's unlikely. I think that because there are such great differences between the ways that people govern morality, I think that maybe it's a little more malleable than that. So that's one thing he says. He says also, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And I don't know. I think degrades human personality. I'm not sure what is. I mean, I know that the segregation is obviously degrading. I just think that there's a certain amount of relativity here. is all I'm saying. Let's see. Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that compels a minority group to obey but does not make binding on itself. Okay, that's a definition that I think we can accept, right? This is a difference. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is also willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. That's fair. And let's see. Later, he says also, I don't know where it is, but at some point he says that you have an obligation to disobey unjust laws, and you also have an obligation to incur the consequences. The thing is that whether a law is just or unjust is somewhat subjective, regardless of this attempt to externalize this ideal. It's still somewhat subjective. So if I decide that a law is unjust because it degrades my personality, but someone else feels like a law is just because it doesn't degrade theirs, or they feel it makes things better in their eyes, who's right? What if I, for example, am addicted to some kind of dangerous drug? I'm not going to specify, but let's say I'm addicted to a dangerous drug. Well, I feel like it's degrading for them to tell me that I can't do what I want with my body, right? So I'm going to disobey this law because it's an unjust law. Well, if your mind is that, well, doing that drug is degrading you, it's degrading your personality, so by barring the drug, we're trying to help that be reversed, then who's right? And you could say, well, the person not wanting the drugs to be legal is right, or the person who's pro-freedom is right. It just depends on where your moral compass is. And I think that's one of the issues with this idea. But it's an interesting idea, disobeying unjust laws. And then he gives several instances where unjust laws have been disobeyed. And he also gives an instance down here with Adolf Hitler. Everything that he did in Germany was legal. That's very interesting. He mentions in this paragraph Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is another biblical reference. They refused to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar, so then he tried to, I think he made them walk through a furnace or something, and they survived. So lots of stuff going on here. This stuff about the just law and the unjust law. You've got more biblical appeals, mentions of Hitler and Germany. So interesting positions. Now down here, this paragraph is where he talks about the white moderate. And he says the white moderate is almost a bigger threat to civil rights than the Ku Klux Klaner. And this is a big statement. It's like, whoa, really? And his logic is that because they are in favor of change but unwilling to assist it, they want to try to calm everything down, that they are actually making it worse. I agree. It says, quote, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with you in the methods of direct action. Who paternalistically believes he can set a timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. He says these people are the real problem, and that's a really interesting idea. Because I'm sure in the minds of those people, they thought they were being lukewarm or sort of moderates, and they were balancing things. But in reality, they were just holding back the tide, and they were holding back the necessary tide, as we see. Okay. Let's see. We got some stuff about tension. In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because of his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? I actually read, just as an aside, I listened on audiobook to the defense that Socrates gave at his trial, and I did this last night, and I was almost moved to tears. I mean, so if you want to listen to something intense, go and check that out. So he's asking some very solid questions here, right? It's like, you're trying to blame me for not being peaceful, but like, isn't that like blaming the one who was robbed for the robbing? So let's see. Sorry, it gets a little bit long, and I know that eventually your eyes are going to glass over. We also have to get to a modest proposal this week. So he mentions here Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement, which was another group that was sort of campaigning for civil rights at the time, and which to at least some degree seemed much more willing to accept the idea of violence as a necessity. They were also Islamic, so that means they were of another religion. Dr. King, of course, is Christian. So he makes that appeal. You'll see at the bottom of this paragraph here, nourished by the Negro's frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination, this movement is made up of people who have lost faith in America and who have absolutely repudiated Christianity and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. So here he's making this appeal based on saying, you know, if you guys don't listen to us and we're the ones willing to do nonviolent action, these guys over here have reached a lot more radical conclusions and they're willing to do this stuff. And, you know, they're not even, he makes that appeal on sameness. He's like, they're not Christian. So, I mean, you can take from that what you will, right? But it is a smart rhetorical strategy, tactic. Okay, he says, I've tried to stand between these two forces, saying that we need to emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the black nationalist. For there is the more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I am grateful to God that through the influence of the Negro Church, the way of nonviolence has become an integral part of our struggle. So again, he's pressing the issue of nonviolence. One of the reasons that nonviolence is effective, by the way, is because it enables the individual to win the optics conflict. So what is the optics conflict? Whenever you're like viewing something in the media, the optics war or the optics conflict is the way that it is seen. So the way that the protests look, right? Are there a lot of people smashing cars and burning things? That's not good for the optics war. That makes you look bad. But if you're the one that's getting beat up and you're not doing any of the sort of attacking on either property or people, then people look at that and they go, why are we beating people in the street for just standing there, right? And then it causes this reaction in people, this like, what the heck is going on? You know, why is this happening? And you end up actually winning, even though you don't throw any punches. It's a really interesting idea, and the thing is that it seems to have worked in a couple of instances, at least to some degree, as far as facilitating change. So I think he's got an interesting point here. But one of the problems, as I mentioned earlier, is that you have to be willing to take blows and willing not to retaliate, which is very, very difficult. It's why they have that purification, the self-purification, where they ask themselves, you know, can you do this? So here he makes appeals to Jesus. He makes appeals to Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. Again, these are all people that these people would revere. If you were trying to speak to, let's say, I'm going to make something up, the United Atheist Conference, you would not make appeals to the Bible. You would not make appeals to biblical figures. If you were speaking to someone from Great Britain, you would probably not mention Thomas Jefferson and Abe Lincoln. They may revere these people just by proxy, but it would not be part of British history, and so there would be smarter appeals, right? And he mentions that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, so he's quoting the doctrine of the United States against it, essentially, or not against it, but like against people who hold it dear. And the other, Jesus Christ was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness. Let's see, there were two extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. This is the Calvary Hill where the three men were crucified, right? Two were extremists for immorality. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love and thereby rose above his environment. Okay, so again, the appeal, biblical references. He mentions the white moderate again. And then he goes after, so now he's leveling criticism, but you notice how long that took. It took a long time for him to warm up his criticism. Now he's leveling direct criticism at the church in Birmingham and its leadership. And he gives a few exceptions, but he is disappointed with the church. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, and who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings and will remain true to it as long as the cord of his life shall lengthen. So he's offering criticisms, but he waited to do so, and he was very, very tactful about the way that he said it. He didn't go after and insult people. He just said, I am disappointed, and I say this as someone who has an investment of this. So let's see. wrapping it up here, let's see. He talks about Jesus and the Christians being accused of being disturbers of the peace, and they were too God intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. The judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irreverent social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Now that is very salient right there. I strike a chord, right? He's going after him. He's like, you're risking more than you think here. You're risking your very livelihood. You think this is just one civil issue, but it's actually part of a much bigger picture that is causing people to lose faith with your institution. And so now he's really like making them see how much they have invested and how what they thought was a simple issue is actually much more complicated. And he talks about the inner spiritual church. And then he ends on a sort of optimistic note. I hope the church will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if it doesn't come to aid, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the struggle of the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal word of God are embodied in our echoing demands. That, again, very salient. Before closing, I feel impelled to mention one other point in your statement that has troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended Birmingham police for keeping order and preventing violence. I doubt that you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its dogs sinking their teeth into unarmed, nonviolent Negroes. I doubt that you would so quickly commend the policemen if you were to observe their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here in the city jail, if you were to watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, if you were to see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys, if you were to observe them, as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together, I cannot join you in your praise of the Birmingham Police Department. So he goes after the law enforcement and their deplorable behavior in Birmingham, especially regarding the dogs and the sort of the beatings and stuff, and kind of making them feel like they're part of the problem in doing so, right? He's saying, you guys praise these people, but you didn't see this stuff. So at the end of the letter, I think this is kind of an interesting thing where his tone gets really jaded right at the end. He saves the big punch for the end. Never before have I written so long a letter. I am afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else can one do when he is alone in a narrow jail cell other than write long letters, think long thoughts, and pray long prayers? If I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope the circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all of their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, so excellent argument, very well structured, very tactful, using timing, right? He doesn't bring the punches out till the end, but even after he gives the big punch, he reins it in a little bit. So study this piece if you want to become a tactful rhetorician. If you want to persuade people and convince them to see your point of view, then you should study the way that this man tried to convince those who were sort of resisting his efforts. Remember that this is one of the pieces that you may write on. I'm also allowing you to write on Children of the Corn if you want to, although we're not going to talk about that one. Just make sure if you do write about Children of the Corn that it doesn't echo too much our if you did the extra credit, just make sure it doesn't echo that assignment too much, because I don't want any similarity reports or confused plagiarism stuff going on or anything like that. So, okay, so I'm going to issue another video on a modest proposal. I'm going to kind of cut them in half so you can watch them in pieces if you want. I'm going to finish one on modest proposal, and then next week I'm going to talk. I'm sorry, I will. Let's see. I will include a segment at the end of the modest proposal video talking a little bit more about writing on these pieces. That was going to be a separate video originally, but I'll probably combine it with the next video. So please be on the lookout for that, most likely on Tuesday afternoon. And let me know if you have any questions. Remember, the only assignment that we have left is the final essay, essay 3, and the discussion board, which I think is due this weekend. And it is a very easy discussion. It's like, what did you think of the class? You know, what did you not like about the class? If you want to like really rip into me because you had a miserable experience, you can, but there are better ways to do it. You should have been sent an evaluation that you could have filled out. I know that I'm sort of a lousy online professor. I try to do the best I can. I'm getting better over time. You know, Blackboard is sometimes just as confusing for me as it is for you. So just please keep that stuff in mind. And if you want to offer any criticisms or anything like that, then try to be respectful about it. I'm open to criticism, but I would prefer that we keep it civil. Okay, so that's all I got for this one. Have a lovely afternoon, and be on the lookout for the next video. Thanks.